Just to get everyone's attention, we have votes that have been called, so it'll probably be a 35-minute delay before we start the hearing. Thank you. Okay, so last votes have been called. Members are on their way. We should be starting soon. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you for everyone being here, and we will start with opening statements on my behalf, and we will not move to any type of questions until our ranking member shows up out of respect for the process here, and I'm sure they'll be joining us soon. Good afternoon. Today's oversight hearing is entitled Destroying Sacred Sites and Erasing Tribal Culture, the Trump administration's construction of the border wall. Before I begin, I want to thank our witnesses here today for taking time to testify about the reckless, harmful destruction of sacred places along our southern border. As we will learn today, this administration has blasted and bulldozed multiple sites, including burial grounds, along the southern border that are sacred to the religion and culture of the TO nation, without any kind of meaningful tribal consultation, and awful without advance notice. So far in my tenure as chairman of this subcommittee, I have been appalled at the utter lack of regard this administration has for upholding our legal trust responsibilities to Indian tribes to protect their sovereignty, their way of life, and yes, their sacred sites. Today, we have reached a new low. Not only has this administration been negligent in its trust responsibility by destroying sacred sites, but DHS and the White House refused our invitation to be here today to explain their actions. In fact, we only learned at 5 p.m. last night, less than 24 hours in advance, that the Interior Department would be sending a witness today. According to the testimony we received last night, the Interior Department will, in part, argue today that blasting sacred sites and cutting down 100-year-old saguaro cacti to build a border wall will actually, quote, help us maintain the character of these land and resources. The administration's gaslighting argument of we have to destroy it in order to protect it is as plainly ridiculous as it is offensive. It is insult to this committee and to the tribal leaders and advocates who have traveled here today to testify. This administration apparently has no shame for the damage it is causing to tribal burial grounds, the Tohono Nation. This is the equivalent to the Tohono Nation, is the equivalent of bulldozing through parts of Arlington National Cemetery. They are so shameless that as we speak, CBP is holding a press event in Arizona entitled Monument Hill Controlled Detonation and Briefing, which features a briefing from CBP personnel and a live detonation on Monument Hill. So rather than sit before this subcommittee, the Department of Homeland Security is detonating sacred burial grounds for a captive audience. I want to be clear. When sacred cultural sites are destroyed in international conflict, it is considered a war crime. Earlier this year, we saw President Trump repeatedly threaten to destroy sacred sites in Iran, to the condemnation of many, including myself, in this country. Well, today as we speak, this White House is doing just that on American soil. Places like Monument Hill and the Quito Spring have been held sacred by the O'odham people since before the United States existed. You will hear from experts and the tribe itself today that these physical places are critical to their culture and religion. It is not enough to do a survey of a cultural site only to blast it away. It is not enough to remove bone fragments that are found and return them to the tribe when the burial site itself is being destroyed. And it is not enough to shoot an email to Chairman Norris mere hours before you bulldoze a site his people have held sacred since time immemorial. These actions are disgusting as well as a flagrant violation of the requirement to consult tribes before decisions are made and to hold in trust the interests and well-being of tribal nations. This behavior is not reflective of the America I have fought for, and I cannot imagine what I would do if I knew that anyone was desecrating the burial grounds of the men and women I fought with at Arlington. It is this committee's mission to shine a light on these atrocities and fight like hell to prevent them from continuing. That's why I'm grateful to have legal experts, tribal leaders, and advocates here today. I greatly look forward to your testimony, and I recognize now the ranking member, Representative Gosar, for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have stated before that the most important task of the federal government is to keep its citizens safe. The flow of drugs and people across our southern border is extremely dangerous, and our Border Patrol is stretched too thin after years of neglect by the previous administrations. I know too well that violence in country south of us drives illegal migration. But those who promote open borders here are doing a favor to the drug cartels, terrorists, and human traffickers. I have supported legislation that provides comprehensive border security by fully funding a border wall and ensuring that we are not only stopping dangerous criminals from coming here illegally, but we're also bringing criminals to justice that are already here. I do, however, believe that we should always be respectful in cases where border security interests intersect with tribal interests. No one in this room believes that there should be ever a desecration of cultural artifacts or remains. I'm disappointed when illegal activities have caused cultural sites to be lost. As has been mentioned, broad waiver authority has been exercised in certain circumstances with the construction of the border wall. But the Department of Interior has still been using and adhering to processes found in the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. Information from the Department of Interior shows that 2 bone fragments to date have been discovered in the project area, dating from the archaic to historic time periods. Both are in the process of being returned to the nearest tribe, the Tohono O'odham. It is my understanding that the water monitoring systems have been put in place to ensure levels remain the same at Quito Baquito Springs. I think
I think you did pretty good. Yeah,
Well,
yeah. No. I'm impressed.
Had one try at that. Illegal migration and the flow of drugs has a monumental impact on our communities. We must work together to help stop the harm to tribes, the American people, and to the environment. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to their testimony, especially the chairman. We just saw each other earlier last week, so 2 weeks in a row. And with that, I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now yield time to Chairman Grijalva for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this important hearing, and also thanking the witnesses for traveling here today and echoing the sentiments of Chair. I'm going to echo the sentiments of Chair Gallego by expressing my deep disappointment that the White House and the Department of Homeland Security did not send representatives in a timely manner and did not respond early enough to this hearing. Last month, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the Tohono O'odham Nation Chairman Norris led me on a tour of sacred sites located in the Organ Pipe National Monument. These sites were areas of significant cultural and historic importance to the nation, including other tribes in the state of Arizona. And as speak, you'll see photos from our visit. The first site we visited was Monument Hill. This is an area sacred to the O'odham people because it is a place where they respectfully placed Apache warrior remains following a raid. This hill is first documented and mentioned in Father Kino's letters when there was nothing but, no communities, nothing there except the O'odham people. To my knowledge, the tribe notified the administration this area was of cultural significance, yet the grading and widening of the road was still conducted. As you can see in this photo, DHS mentioned that they would back off on developing the hill, but the work is still being done. 2 weeks following the visit at Monument Hill on February 6, 2020, I received word that the Department of Homeland Security began using explosives on the hill to construct its wall. And we have a video of that as well. The second place we visited was Quito Baquito Springs, an area mentioned in historic papers as early as the 17th century. Not only does this area host sacred spring water, it is also the location of a village and burial grounds of ancestral O'odham people. Tribal archaeologists showed me bone fragments in this area. On January 27, 2020, just 7 days following the visit, the Department of Homeland Security bulldozed the artifacts area that held sacred seashells, bone fragments, and pottery fragments. Thousands of years of history and cultural significance disappeared. Since my visit, 50% of the sacred sites identified by the nation have been destroyed. The fact that the federal government is continuing to blast this area with human bone fragments of several tribes in the 21st century is quite frankly barbarous. What would normally be considered a war crime for destroying cultural sites in another country is now considered status quo of this president and the administration, and this needs to stop. In fact, just last week, the Department of Homeland Security spokeswoman stated, the United States is in a border emergency. We are building more wall faster than ever before. The department is not consulting the tribe faster than it did before. It is clear this administration will not uphold its trust responsibility to tribes. We see that with the inconsistencies with each agency's tribal consultation policy and their lack of implementing some form of communication with tribes, especially when it comes to major projects that drastically impact sacred sites. As a country, we should be completely appalled by the steps the administration has taken to ensure that, to desecrate the sacred sites. And it has been completed when the city's wall is being erected. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, Mr. Chairman, and getting some answers as to why the administration continues to treat tribes as second-class citizens in the lands they have owned and lived before the very development of this country. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and appreciate the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're now turned to our witnesses. I'd like to transition to our first panel witnesses for today. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will expire when the red light comes on. And I will ask you to please wrap up your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we question the witnesses. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Ned Norris, the chairman of the To'odham O'odham Nation of Arizona.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It is an honor to have been invited to testify before you today. It is my great honor also to recognize Committee Chairman Raul Grijalva, in whose district our tribal nation is located. I am Ned Norris Jr., and I am the chairman of the To'odham O'odham Nation, a federally recognized tribe with more than 34,000 tribal citizens. We have lived in what is now Arizona and northern Mexico since time immemorial, with no consideration for our sovereign rights or the welfare of our people. The international boundary was drawn through our ancestral territory in 1854, separating our people and our lands. As a result, our reservation shares a 62-mile border with Mexico, the longest along the southern border of any tribe in the United States. 17 O'odham communities with approximately 2,000 tribal citizens are still located in our historical homelands in Mexico. O'odham on both sides of the border share the same language, culture, religion, and history. Our citizens cross to participate in pilgrimages and ceremonies at important religious and cultural sites on both sides of the border, to visit family and friends, and to pay respects to loved ones buried in cemeteries on either side. Today, only a portion of our ancestral territory is encompassed within the boundaries of our current reservation. Originally, our homelands ranked well beyond these boundaries, ranged well beyond these boundaries, and included what is now Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, and San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge. The nation has significant and well-documented connection to these lands and the religious, cultural, and natural resources located there, including at Quito Vaquito Springs and at Monument Hill. The National Park Service, the federal agency with management authority at the Organ Pipe National Monument, has acknowledged that Quito Vaquito Springs is sacred to the nation. Nevertheless, CBP contractors working on the border wall recently bulldozed a large area near Quito Vaquito Springs, destroying burial grounds. Another culturally important site is Monument Hill, which is the final resting place for many of our ancestors who recovered bones fragments from these show. Earlier this month, CBP contractors conducted blasting there, notifying the nation of its plans only the day the blasting occurred. And I am sorry to report that just 2 hours ago, CBP conducted another controlled detonation at Monument Hill. The federal government's continued destruction of our religious and cultural resources and nothing less but bulldozing of our church grounds and our cemeteries. For us, this is no different from DHS building a 30-foot wall along Arlington Cemetery or to the grounds of the National Cathedral. This destructive actions would not have occurred without the waiver provision in Section 102C of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. That allows DHS to waive any law it wishes in order to expedite border barrier construction. We urge Congress to withdraw or at least limit DHS waiver authority as it is dangerously broad and has allowed DHS nearly dictatorial authority to run roughshod over the rights of the To'odham and other border communities in the United States. There is no acceptable reason why border communities should not be protected by the same laws and have the same ability to challenge agency action as Americans living in every other part of the United States. Making matters worse for us is the lack of an enforceable tribal consultation requirement. While agencies pay lip service to consultation, tribal governments have little ability to enforce consultation policies when federal agencies choose to ignore them. A statutory consultation requirement would help put an end to the frequent disregard for our concerns, our expertise, and our right to self-determination. The federal government owes our government and the governments of local border communities more respect. We wish to thank Chairman Grijalva and Subcommittee Chairman Gallego for their efforts to resolve this continuing problem through their introduction in the last Congress of the requirements, expectations, and standard procedures for executive consultation with Tribes Act, and for recently holding a hearing on similar draft legislation. Preservation of history and culture of O'odham is not just important to the O'odham Nation, it is important to the preservation of the history and culture of the United States. As we preserve Civil War battlefields and cemeteries and honor holy places of worship everywhere in the United States, we also must preserve and protect such places of significance to the O'odham and First Americans in this part of our country. The nation thanks you for shining a light on an ongoing destruction of our cultural resources and sacred sites. I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chairman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, so that he may introduce our next witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be able to introduce a constituent and a former professor of mine, Professor Sarah Krakoff, who is a professor at the University of Colorado School of Law, my alma mater. She's the Shaden Chair for Experiential Learning. Her expertise in American Indian law, natural resources, and public land law, as well as environmental justice, is well known. She's been a prolific writer on any number of those topics. She's a Yale and Berkeley graduate who clerked on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, previously led the University of Colorado Law School's American Indian Law Clinic, and I can certainly attest to her leadership and passion on these issues. And as a former student of hers, I'm just very grateful for her to be here and offer her testimony. I'm fairly certain I did well in her class, but I'll let her clarify the record if that's not the case. So thank you so much, Professor Krakoff, for joining us.
Thank you, Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Gassar, and members of the subcommittee, and also Representative Neguse for that overly generous introduction. I hope you don't get me back with a few key questions like I did perhaps to you in law school. I'm really honored to be able to testify at this important hearing. My name is Sarah Krakoff, and I am a law professor at the University of Colorado. I hope my remarks will be of use to the committee. As Chairman Norris described, construction crews are blasting an Organ Pipe National Monument and have already destroyed indigenous burial grounds. Many additional sites are at risk along the more than 1,900 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. I would like to make 2 points about this. First, the administration's approach to building the wall has disproportionate impacts on American Indian tribes because of their unique ties to federal public lands. Second, the damage is avoidable, but is a predictable consequence of the administration's sweeping waivers of federal laws, which deprive the federal agencies, the tribes, and the American public of the information necessary to decide whether the benefits of the wall outweigh its human and environmental costs. With regard to the first point, tribes' historic territories extended well beyond their current reservation boundaries. Tribes therefore have religious, cultural, and historic sites throughout federal public lands. Hundreds of treaties, federal laws, and executive orders recognize this by affirming that tribes have rights that extend beyond their current reservation boundaries. Specific laws and policies would normally protect tribal rights on federal public lands, including the following: the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which states that it is the policy of the United States to protect American Indians' inherent right of freedom to exercise their traditional religions, including access to sacred sites. The National Historic Preservation Act, which protects traditional and cultural properties on federal public lands. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which requires permits for excavation or destruction of archaeological resources on public lands. And the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which provides protections for Native American burial and archaeological sites on public lands. Two bedrock environmental statutes, the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act, would also normally protect tribes and the public's interests in public lands. This leads to the second point. Why, despite all of these laws, are construction crews blasting in national monuments and wildlife preserves? The answer is that the Secretary of Homeland Security has waived the application of dozens of laws, including all of those mentioned above. The Secretary's power comes from Section 102 of the Real ID Act of 2005, which authorized the waiver of all laws that could impede the expeditious construction of barriers and fences. Initially, despite the breadth of the waiver power, the Secretary's authority was somewhat bounded by the fact that in the Secure Fence Act of 2006, Congress only authorized expenditures for roughly 700 miles of fences and barriers. The Secretary's waivers could only extend to the areas that Congress had specifically authorized for construction. This is not to understate the human, environmental, and cultural impacts that resulted from those initial stretches of a border fence. They were considerable, including flooding of Nogales and other areas, deaths of rare and protected wildlife, and destruction of wildlife migration corridors. But impacts from the pre-existing border fence will pale in comparison to the effects of the current administration's indiscriminate use of waivers. For context, the Bush administration exercised the waiver 4 times for 5 projects. The Obama administration did not exercise the waiver at all. The Trump administration, acting without congressional authorization for its border wall, has already exercised the waiver provision 15 times. The waivers have covered between 29 and 37 statutes, including all of those listed above, as well as the Antiquities Act, the Wilderness Act, and the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act. To summarize, the administration is heedlessly destroying irreplaceable resources in which Native nations have unique interests by setting aside all of the legal protections that were carefully designed to protect tribes and all other Americans. None of this is necessary. Even if a border-long barrier were an important goal, it could be completed without suspending all of our environmental and other protective laws, but it could not be completed on the administration's political timetable. The federal government has long recognized that its broad powers in Indian affairs are or should be accompanied by a corresponding solemn obligation to honor the rights and interests of the peoples who preceded us on the continent. Instead of furthering this trust obligation, the administration is exercising its executive power in derogation of tribal rights. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Shannon Keller O'Loughlin, the Executive Director of the Association of American Indian Affairs.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gallego and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for allowing the Association on American Indian Affairs to testify today. I'm Shannon Keller O'Loughlin, the Executive Director and the Attorney for the Association, and I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Since its founding in 1922, the Association on American Indian Affairs has been protecting sacred sites all over Indian country. Sacred sites and ceremonial grounds are found everywhere in this nation that we share together. Some are within the exterior boundaries of tribal reservations, but most are located on federal, state, and privately owned lands. Sacred sites include areas commemorating important tribal events and tribal people, much like the Jefferson Memorial, or are burial areas like the Arlington Cemetery or a church cemetery. And other sites are where the presence of our creators live and speak to us, just like your brick and mortar churches. In the first 150 years of U.S. governance, political leaders understood that in order to assimilate and civilize Indian tribes, that you must separate us from our sacred places, from our beliefs, and outlaw our languages and our cultural and religious practices. And you did that. You criminalized our religious and traditional practices and even held back rations if we were caught practicing our dances. The U.S. also allowed its officials and others to take over our homelands, to desecrate burial and ceremonial places, steal our ancestors' remains and their burial belongings, and take important cultural patrimony and sacred objects. Despite more than a century of this religious persecution, we continue our ceremonial lives at sacred sites all over this shared country. And the ability to do so stems from the perseverance of tribes and their citizens, and the federal government's ongoing recognition of its legal and moral responsibilities to protect sacred sites and American Indian religious freedoms. Congress investigated the U.S.'s attack on Indian religious freedom back in 1978 and declared then a policy to protect and preserve our inherent rights of freedom of belief and exercise of religion, including the protection and access to our sacred sites. Since then, the federal government has taken a multitude of actions demonstrating that its federal trust responsibility includes the consideration and protection of sacred sites in federal decision-making. You have passed numerous bipartisan laws. Presidents have issued executive orders. Federal agencies have developed MOUs, reports, action plans, and the courts have recognized that the federal trust responsibility includes consultation with Indian tribes when federal actions threaten sacred sites. The federal government has unquestionably assumed the legal and moral responsibility to protect our sacred sites. Any departure from this policy flies in the face of established political and societal norms and violates our civil and human rights, not to mention our own tribal laws, customs, and traditions. Today, we stand together with the Tohono O'odham Nation and many other tribal nations who aren't here today, who are fighting against this current administration's failure to include our sovereign governments in any action that has the potential to affect our environmental, cultural, and religious rights and freedoms. Since day one of this administration, it has chosen to act unilaterally in Indian affairs and remove even the bare minimum procedures of our government-to-government relationship. We've not only had the ground fall out from beneath us at Standing Rock, at Bears Ears, with BLM land management decisions in Alaska and elsewhere, and at the Tohono O'odham sacred areas at Monument Hill and Organ Pipe. But now the processes under the National Environmental Policy Act are also being threatened by new proposed regulations from the CEQ, further eroding tribal consultation, eliminating cumulative and indirect impacts from environmental review, and taking away our ability to provide less destructive options for development. I'm sure this subcommittee fully understands the devastating statistics in Indian country, our children's suicide rates, our heart disease rates, the numbers of our women, children, and men raped, murdered, and trafficked. Then you must understand how important, how absolutely necessary our cultural and religious practices are to our healing. We cannot recover from centuries of trauma and dispossession unless we can protect and maintain the places where we go to become whole again. The association fully supports Congress in its effort to investigate and cure Indian sacred site destruction and religious freedom violations at the border wall and elsewhere. And I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Steve Hodop, a retired independent contractor and environmental specialist.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Gozar, and other members of the committee. I appreciate the chance to testify before you this afternoon. For the last 10 years, until my retirement in March, I've been working as a contractor supporting CBP environmental compliance efforts, primarily in the state of Arizona. The major point of my testimony today is that in the execution of its border security mission, CBP fully complies with all the applicable laws as provided in the REAL ID Act, and in fact, often exceeds the legal requirements. In 2016, the House Natural Resources Committee requested the Interior Department to provide a list of all peer-reviewed studies which documented impacts on natural resources resulting from border construction. After 6 months, the Interior Department could not produce a single study. It's important to understand that the waiver authorized in the REAL ID Act only applies to barrier construction. It doesn't apply to any other construction activities by Border Patrol, towers, Border Patrol stations, roads, etc. It's also important that when the Secretary applies the REAL ID Act, although it would waive these laws in their entirety, CBP, in fact, complies with the substantive portions of these laws. For example, if the National Historic Preservation Act were to be waived, CBP would still conduct a cultural resource survey. CBP would still treat any resources that are discovered in accordance with the procedures that are in place for protecting cultural resources. CBP has been working cooperatively with the Tohono O'odham Nation for a number of years to develop and implement border security on the nation's lands. For the last 10 years specifically, we've been working on deployment of a tower array within the nation's lands. We have coordinated with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer on all the roads, all the tower sites, and where we've found cultural resources, we've gone to alternate tower sites. We've used ground-penetrating radar to go beyond the visual surveys, which are normally the standard protocol for locating cultural resources. I'd like to talk a little bit and turn back the clock a little with regard to Monument Hill. In 2002, tragically, Park Ranger Chris Egel, Oregon Park National Park Ranger, Monument Ranger, was killed by at the border by illegal drug cartels. Within a few months, the Park Service shut down the entire border and 60% of the park because it was unsafe for visitors. Within a year, the Park Service began an environmental assessment. The Park Service built the first road all along the entire border of the monument and the adjacent fence. When they did their environmental assessment in 2003, they found no significant cultural resources along this road, including at Monument Hill and Quito Baquito. The tribe made no comments about the cultural significance of these sites. In 2007, CBP issued an environmental assessment to upgrade the fence at Lukeville. This would widen the footprint from 30 to 60 feet. And in this case, again, CBP issued an environmental assessment. We did cultural resource surveys. Even though this wall section was waived, we found no cultural resources. The tribe made no comments about the cultural significance of Monument Hill, even though border walls was constructed on Monument Hill. And in 2012, again, CBP did an environmental assessment and about maintenance of the road on Monument Hill and on the fence on Monument Hill. And again, the tribe made no comment, and CBP found no significant risks to cultural resources from that action. So only now in May of 2019, when CBP has again solicited comments from the tribe and others, has the issue of this sacred sites been raised to CBP, not in any of these previous actions. With regard to Quito Baquito, again, CBP has worked cooperatively with the Park Service, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, to have appropriate standoff distances for water withdrawal and protection of that important resource during the border construction activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will start asking questions. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Chairman Norris, can you just take what Mr. Hodak just said? Do you have anything to respond to what he just said, why there was no interest before?
Thank you, Chairman Gallego, members of the committee. It's kind of interesting to hear Mr. Hodak make those comments because the situation is different. We're not talking about blasting. We're not talking about bulldozing. We're not talking about desecration. We're not talking about running through archaeological sites. We're not talking about digging up graves and in that situation that he was describing.
So is it safe to say what Mr. Hodak was describing is not at all the same as what's describing right now? And therefore, there wasn't probably as much opposition because it wasn't as intrusive and as insulting. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Norris. Let's move on to something else. In a recent meeting, you mentioned to me that immediately following Chairman Grijalva's visit to the border to bring attention to the tribe's sacred sites, CBP actually skipped several miles of wall construction to begin blasting on Monument Hill. Do you think that this shows that CBP was aware of the harm and controversy blasting Monument Hill would cause and didn't want to wait to hear opposition? What is your interpretation why they just suddenly just jumped a couple miles to Monument Hill?
Well, I think because exactly that. I think that they knew that the nation and its people were going to be seriously concerned about blasting, concerned about the desecration, concerned about these things. And I think they knew that, and so they decided, well, let's go ahead and move forward and start doing what we need to do, because we know the nation's going to raise issue in opposition to that.
It's also true that CBP has widened roads both on Monument Hill and Quito Paquito Spring without notifying the tribe at all, or did they notify you in a very shortened manner?
Well, with regards to the blasting, I didn't learn about the blasting until the day they started. I received an email from the tribal liaison that said, we're going to start blasting today. In fact, that was the only notification that I had. One of the things that I raised to that person is that I said, why are you giving me notice now when you didn't give me any notice when you decided to bulldoze and grade through the Quito Paquito Springs area? And I have not received any response to that question.
Ms. Krakoff, did I say that correctly? Krakoff?
It's Krakoff, thanks for asking.
Thank you. Ms. Krakoff, just hearing what Chairman Norris just described as the consultation that was given to him, what would you describe that as? If you, in your terms as a lawyer, what would you describe what was just discussed by Chairman Norris?
Inadequate, perfunctory, and I wish I could say that it was atypical, but often federal requests for tribal consultation are just trying to check the box that they did something.
Excellent. The Department of the Interior's testimony today argues that the construction of a border wall will actually improve protection of sacred sites. Given the tribe's extensive experience working on border security, this is to you, Chairman Norris, and the destruction that has already occurred, do you think this is a valid argument?
Chairman, would you repeat the question, please?
Sure, Chairman. Part of the argument that we're going to hear today from both the administration and probably some of our fellow members of Congress is that the construction of the border wall will actually help protect sacred sites. Given what you know and given the history of the Choctaw Nation protecting the border, do you agree with their argument? This is why they should be able to blast through these monuments.
Well, I find it very hard to believe that the effort will help protect sacred sites, when in fact, to the contrary, that has not been what was going on now. There have been desecrations, there have been blasting, there have been artifacts, there have been remains that have been ruined and forever lost, and so I have a tendency to disagree that this is going to protect those, because blasting them is not protection.
Thank you. Ms. O'Loughlin, in both our remarks, Chairman Norris and I referenced Arlington National Cemetery as a burial ground with national historic and cultural as well as personal significance. Your testimony points out the double standard that exists for protection of tribal sacred burial grounds versus other cemeteries, war memorials, and churches. Can you expand on this?
Well, this is the result of a historic federal policy and law that was meant to separate us from our sacred places, that was meant to take away our religion so that we would assimilate and more land would be opened up for colonization and for the growth of the new nation. And U.S. law has never really correctly repaired this issue. So today we have corrective measures like NAGPRA, National Historic Preservation Act, some executive orders and other acts that help bring tribes to the table before these decisions are made. But often that's not the case, and that's not what we've been finding during this administration.
Thank you. And I yield the remaining time to the ranking member, Gosar. Yield, that's true. I yield to Representative Gosar.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now that we've heard the testimony and moved to the question part of this hearing, it's a good time for me to ask my colleagues, do you actually care about the environment, or is it just another political prop? Oh, I know the answer. When convenient, it's a wonderful political prop, as we saw. If you look at the, do we have that up here? Yeah. As we saw at this committee 3 weeks ago with the Democrat effort to ban mining in Minnesota, you love to protect the environment here, but don't hesitate to sacrifice the environment of the Congo and the lives of Congolese children at the altar of your protectionism. This hearing today is another reckless example. Uncontrolled illegal immigration is an overwhelmingly destructive activity. You can see by what we're actually showing pictures of. They were just taken. It is an activity that has deeply scarred the border regions from the San Diego Wildlife Refuge and Organ Pipe National Monument to the Rio Grande and Big Bend National Park. Drug running, human trafficking, trash, feces, water pollution, damage to tinas, springs and seeps, foot and illegal vehicle transit. All these damage, all of the destruction as a result of illegal trafficking has left deep scars and environmental destruction across the landscape. If the federal government were required to consider the environmental impacts of this open borders policies under the NEPA, the preferred alternative, we would certainly be a border wall. There is no question that the deep impact on natural resources, waters, and species by this traffic throughout the landscape has a real impact. However, in pursuit of a political open borders agenda, you're happy to ignore and minimize the environmental impact. You are also willing not only minimize, but degrade the human impact of the lack of border control. The Tucson sector of the border continues to have some of the highest rates of death among border crossers, accounting for 20% of all border deaths in 2018. But it isn't just deaths of random border crossers that you ignore with an open borders agenda. It's our hardworking personnel as well. When you arrive at Organ Pipe Cactus Monument, as stated earlier, you're greeted by the Chris Eggle Visitor Center. Christopher William Eggle was a law enforcement park ranger with the National Park Service. Growing up, he was an Eagle Scout, a National Honor Society student, a valedictorian of his class, and was elected president of his class at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Chris Eggle devoted his life to protecting our country and our public lands. Chris Eggle was shot and killed in the line of duty at Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument on August 9, 2002, while pursuing members of a drug cartel who fled into the United States after committing a string of murders in Mexico. He was just 28 years old. He died because we didn't have control of our borders and we had failed to protect our people. Which brings us to this reckless political hearing. I get it. You don't want the wall. You don't want to work with Trump administration in building the wall. In fact, you offer no alternatives in securing that border. Despite your inaction, the wall is being built. President Trump is doing what he promised to do, and no one should be shocked about that outcome. So now the questions. Ms. Krakoff, I'm wondering, do you think illegal border crossers bathing, drinking, and defecating in Quito Paquito Springs and other Tahiyas, seeps and springs will have an environmental impact on the resources and species at these critically important desert habitats? Yes or no?
I think we would be able to assess the harms of the
yes or
wall
no?
construction versus
it's
the
my time.
harms
It's
of the
my
border
time. Let me
crossing.
It's my time.
If we actually
It
did
is
the
my
environmental
time.
analysis
It is my time.
that NEPA requires.
It is my time. Do you believe in climate change?
Yes,
Does man have an impact on it?
absolutely.
So I take it that you're yes on this one then. Do you think illegal border crossings hiding in the adobes at Blankenship Ranch House or Gaucho Line Camp, both registered historic places, are causing environmental damage to these historic protected places? And does the arson of the Bonita Camp Line Shack, which was a protected structure burned down by illegal crossers, of a concern to you? Yes or no?
I don't know that you're assuming the facts ahead of time. If all that were occurring, sure, that would be of concern to me.
This is what has actually happened. So, I mean, you should be concerned about that, if what I heard from your testimony. Now, do you think that the unauthorized vehicle routes and illegal off-road vehicles travel are impacting the border environment, including species, habitat, culture, and archaeological sites? Because CBP says that this sort of UVR activity is questionable? I mean, we see it up here. I mean, that's endangering the wildlife, is it not?
Many things endanger the wildlife, and so does the
And
construction of the border
illegal
wall.
crossings don't take that into consideration? They were fully apprised of the ESA, right? Endangered Species Act. I think you brought that up. So
Yes,
the illegal,
well,
they're fully aware that they're harming species.
I
right?
don't believe they're complying with the ESA. I don't believe there have been the kinds of consultations, in fact, I know they're not, that would be required under the ESA because the Secretary of Homeland
Well, once
Security
again,
has waived
I wasn't bringing
application
that
of
up.
the
What I was
Endangered
talking
Species
about
Act.
is illegal crossings. I think the facts speak for themselves.
Thank you, Representative Gozar. We now recognize Representative Deb Holland.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, thank you. First, I just need to say this. Mr. Hodap, you sat here and misrepresented your alleged consultation with the Tohono O'odham tribe, and I take issue with that, and I just needed to bring that up so it's on the record. I want to also make sure that every single one of my colleagues in this hearing room understands that this hearing is about sacred sites of the Tohono O'odham tribe, and that's all. That's what we're here to discuss, and that's what we're here to defend. And so my first question, actually I have a statement first. Thank you, Chairman, for having this hearing. As one of the first Native women in Congress, I find it my duty to speak up for Indian country and the administration's lack of respect for the federal trust responsibility we have to Native nations. During the recent NCAI session, this was exemplified when the Interior failed to answer basic questions from tribal leaders, and is further illustrated with the construction at the border wall. When tribes do not have a seat at the table, Indigenous history is lost. In this case, the Tohono O'odham Nation has lost pieces of its ancestors to bulldozers and explosions. This bears repeating. The president threatens to destroy Iran's cultural sites, and yes, that would be a tremendous loss to our world. It is considered an international war crime when he states this. But how is what is happening here on the Tohono O'odham Nation any different? This is also not the first time this administration has moved forward to destroy Indigenous sacred sites with no tribal consultation. They recently opened up Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, the ancestral homelands of the Pueblo people, for drilling, instead of protecting these Indigenous sacred sites. This irreparably ruins over 1,000 years of Indigenous culture and ceremonial sites. It's a complete failure of the federal government's trust responsibility and lack of respect for Native people in this country. And in spite of how the administration finagles their way to get this done, and they stand by the fact that they're saying this is legal, it's wrong. It's sacrilegious. And it's not who we are as Americans. So as far as I'm concerned, they can go around and do everything legally. It is immoral. It's immoral. And I'm still trying to figure out how the president sleeps at night. Chairman Norris, your testimony discusses two cultural sites that have been damaged by the border wall construction: Quito Paquito Springs and Monument Hill, but these sites are not on the reservation. Why are these sites important to you and your people if they are not on your reservation?
Chairman Gallego, members of the committee, Congresswoman, thank you for that question. Regardless of whether or not these sites are on or off the Tohono O'odham Nation, you know, we're on this reservation not because we wanted to be on this reservation, but our ancestral lands extended well beyond where our current reservation land is today. And so in that, we have an obligation, we have a responsibility, we have a vested interest in protecting and securing the safety of our ancestors and the remains of our ancestors, and protecting these sacred sites. Regardless of whether or not they're on our current reservation land, they are still within the ancestral lands of the O'odham, and that's why it's important to us.
Thank you. How have tribal citizens responded to the news of DHS bulldozing and blasting of the nation's sacred sites in Organ Pipe?
It's hard to It's hard to see the blasting that you showed on the video today. Because I know in my heart and what our elders have told us and what we have learned, that that area is home to our ancestors. and by blasting and doing what we saw today, has totally disturbed, totally forever damaged our people. Thank you.
I yield, Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Holland. I now recognize Representative Garcia.
Thank you, Chairman Gallego and Ranking Member Cook or Gozar. Thank you to the witnesses who are here today. The first question that I want to ask is, what kind of consultation has there been with the tribes who have raised objections to the blasting and the clearing away of the land to build the wall? And I would like to direct that to Mr. Horaf.
I'm not directly involved as a CBP employee as I retired last March, but what I can tell you in general is that CBP issued a letter in May of 2019 soliciting input broadly from all interested parties, including the tribe. That input was open, that door for input was open for 3 months, and CBP is considering that input as they implement and construct the barrier in that area.
Do you consider that to be a formal engagement with the tribes or casual conversations?
In my personal opinion, it's not formal consultation as provided for under the statutes, but you have to remember that the administration has waived these statutes, so there is discussion, but it's not under the formal procedures.
So you could pretty much do whatever you want because of the waiver?
Within,
what you're saying?
I mean, if there were, the Congress has authorized a waiver to apply to any law that the Secretary believes is required in order to permit expeditious fence construction.
So you could do whatever you want, basically.
That's the authorization that Congress has
Thank you.
provided.
Chairman Norris, what would you respond to the same question about what's referred to as this consultation with the tribes that allegedly took place?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Congress. Thank you, Congressman, for that question. That is not consultation. That is not government-to-government consultation. A telephone call letting us know what's going on, or even a meeting that is called between the parties is not consultation. It is not leader to leader. It is not with the people that have the authority to make the decisions that are going to impact us or may impact them. And so these meetings that are being referred to, in our opinion, has never been consultation. We have never been consulted on a government-to-government level on this issue by anyone, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Department of Interior, anybody. You may get some folks that are coming here and testify and say that we do consultation. We've done many consultations over the course of time. I don't doubt that. But ask the question to them, how many of these consultations were done pursuant to this particular wall construction activity and the desecration that's been going on? And I guess they're going to tell you none of them.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I have some questions for the following panel as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Garcia. And now we'll move to Representative Soto. As other members of the minority come in, we will also be recognizing them. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Norris, thank you for being here today. I could not imagine how painful this all is for you and the Tohono O'odham tribe. I know that we'll have major debates over border walls in Washington and through the courts, but I think the key here today is that these things can be still built respectfully and going through the process and making sure we're not destroying people's heritage in the process. And I think that's what this is really about today. It's doing it in a respectful way as these debates go on. Chairman Norris, you had outlined a variety of border patrol initiatives that the Tohono O'odham Nation has jump-started over the past few decades. Often these initiatives require coordination with ICE special agents, border patrol operatives, and the FBI. Can you elaborate on the work and relationship that the nation has maintained with these non-tribal entities?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Congressman. I sit here and I share with you that the Tohono O'odham Nation's leadership, I have 2 of our 22 legislative council members with me today, has a long history of working with the Border Patrol. Even at the opposition of our own people, our leadership has worked with the Border Patrol. The Tohono O'odham Nation understands and realizes the need to protect the United States of America. And we will do what is necessary, and we believe what we have done, short of building a wall, to do what we can to ensure the security of the United States of America. We understand that, and we will continue that relationship. Many times, decisions that are made in Washington, D.C. can have a negative effect on the relationship that we spent many years building with the local folks on the back at home. And so we have a long history, but we've done that in good conscience. We've done that with giving all consideration to what the impacts are going to be, not only to the United States of America, but also to the Tohono O'odham Nation itself. And so we will continue to work on the relationship. We will continue to do what is necessary short of building a wall. We will never agree to a wall that is being built. We will never agree to what is being built now in this desecration of our sacred sites. But we have developed a relationship that we will continue, but it makes it difficult when decisions that are made in Washington, D.C. that are negatively impacting that relationship that we spent a long time to build with the local folks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm also concerned about the precedent set right now, the dangerous precedent that could be set for other tribal sites throughout the nation. You referenced in your testimony Section 102C of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act and the waiver authority granted to DHS within it. Are there other sacred sites or cultural resources of significance to the nation that are likely to be negatively impacted by the ongoing and planned border wall construction?
In addition to Monument Hill, in addition to Quito Baquito, further west of there is another area in the Cabeza Preta Monument, National Monument area, commonly referred to as Las Playas. Right in that area has been identified a ceremonial ground that, in my estimation, is about a football field in length and about a half a football field in width. We have history, we have our elders, we have archaeologists that have identified that area as ceremonial grounds to the Hiachet O'odham people, our lineage with the Hiachet O'odham. And even just a little bit further down, another 4 or 5 miles from there, there is a definite burial ground, burial site within the current road of the border, of the proposed border wall. That is a significant burial ground. There is no way around that. In November, we had proposed a letter to the Department of Homeland Security, some alternatives in addressing the sacred sites, some alternatives in that may want to consider in working with us to try and eliminate the desecration that's going to go on if they continue to bulldoze. I got a response from that letter. They basically ignored the recommendations that we were making as alternatives.
Thanks, and my time's expired.
Thank you, Representative Soto. We now recognize Chairman Grijalva.
Chairman, and let me reaffirm what our colleague Ms. Holland said. The necessary debate about the border wall and my opposition to it on many levels is a debate that we've been having and will continue to have. And I think that's important. But what we're talking about here today is a very significant point, and she mentioned it. It's about sacred sites, it's about trust responsibility, and it is about abuse of power. And I think that we have to keep that in focus, that the nation has, through its own pocketbooks of its people, has provided paramedic support for migrants that are out in the desert, has provided additional law enforcement and response, watched their roads being destroyed because of the use by Border Patrol, and from their own revenues, they've sustained that. And so to even imply that this is something other than, I think is a huge mistake. Chairman Norris, one of the issues that you brought up and I thought was important is to talk a little bit about how you see the relationship in terms of how the resources that DHS has employed to assess the cultural significance. One of the things that these waivers do and the Real ID does is that it's not just a question of expediting, you just overlook things and with legal protection. And so the cultural significance of the sites that we're talking about, plus others that have been identified in the past, in your opinion, has DHS adequately surveyed Organ Pipe Monument for tribal impacts? Have the surveys been completed that reflect input from the nation? And the National Park Service survey that identified a number of important archaeological and cultural sites in the Tucson project area, was that study reflected in any that you know of, in anything that DHS has done?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Let me just talk about the National Park Service's own archaeological study of 11 miles of the border in the Organ Pipe. In that study, it found that it is probable that significant presently unrecorded surface level and buried archaeological deposits, mainly the sacred site and cultural patrimony about which the nation is worried, persist across where the wall is being built. That was the statement out of that study. In addition, the park concluded that we must assume that all such unrecorded deposits will be destroyed over the course of the ensuing border wall construction. So simply to say that somebody such as Mr. Hodap or anyone else at his level came out and did surveys and looked at this area is not an in-depth archaeological survey of that particular area.
Okay. Thank you. You know, anytime the questions are raised about the wall, and in this particular issue here that I think is very much different, the response is always, well, you're for open borders, you're for murderers, thieves, drug runners, people smugglers, you're condoning the death of a ranger because you have questions about the wall. None of that is true. None of that is true. And I think that if I may, Mr. Chairman, that this discussion has to focus on the jurisdiction this committee has in terms of Indian country and the protection of those laws that were put in place to try to reaffirm an identity that had been attempts to wipe out. And I think this is an important issue. It's a precedent. And the fact that there is no consultation, the fact that the trust responsibility is being violated, and the fundamental question of sovereignty is being violated as well, I think requires this committee to explore whatever possibilities are available to us. You know, it's okay for this administration to try to undo NEPA. It's okay for this administration to try to undo ESA. It's okay for a major funder of this president's campaigns and inauguration to get the contract to build a fence in Organ Pipe. That is somehow permissible and okay. It's not okay. And I think there's things that we need to look into in this committee, and I appreciate this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to take the first panel for answering our questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. I now invite panel 2 to take their places at the witness table. As with the previous panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired. When the red light comes on, I will ask you to please wrap up your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we question the witnesses. Now I'd like to introduce our distinguished witnesses at some point. First witness is Dr. Ana Maria Ortiz, the Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Government Accountability. Dr. Ortiz.
Good morning, or good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Gallego, Ranking Member Kosar, Chair Grijalva, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for having me here today. During the expansion of the United States, the federal government forcibly removed countless Native Americans from their original homelands. Other tribes ceded lands and resources to the federal government in treaties and agreements. Recognizing that Indian tribes' interests in historic sites and natural resources did not end with their relocation, the United States later enacted several laws designed to protect Indian cultural and natural resources, a goal consistent with the federal trust responsibility. Tribal consultation requirements are an important element of these laws. When triggered, tribal consultation provisions require agencies to consult with tribes on activities and infrastructure projects that risk affecting current or ancestral lands and resources. Tribal consultation is a critical mechanism for demonstrating the United States' commitment to tribal sovereignty and its respect for the government-to-government relationship with tribes. More than 60% of the comments GAO reviewed from 100 tribes highlighted potential impediments to federal tribal consultation. When tribes get notification too late in a project, important decisions may already have been made. When agencies fail to adequately weigh tribal input, they can imperil cultural resources that might have been preserved with a modest adjustment. One tribe told us that an agency's failure to consult when approving county road work resulted in desecration of a burial mound, scattering their ancestors' remains and exposing them to the elements. Poorly executed tribal consultation limits tribal governments' opportunities for input, sows mistrust, and can expose agencies to legal challenges later on. Thankfully, several agencies have taken steps to improve the likelihood of successful tribal consultation. For example, HUD and 2 other agencies have developed systems to help identify tribes that should be consulted on projects because they have current or ancestral interests in an area or resource. EPA's policy requiring formal written communication from a senior agency official to an affected tribe following a consultation has facilitated positive outcomes despite sometimes challenging circumstances. One tribe told us that they considered its consultation with the EPA a success, even when the tribe disagreed with the agency's final decision, because the letter helped it to understand the rationale behind the decision. This example underscores a critical takeaway from GAO's research, that effective tribal consultation does not always mean that everyone agrees on the outcome. It does mean that agencies do their best to obtain tribal input in a timely fashion, weigh that input appropriately, and respect the government-to-government relationship with tribes. Or, in the words of one tribe we spoke with, striving for the intent of consultation requirements rather than going through the motions of compliance. GAO has made recommendations to 17 agencies on how to improve their approaches to tribal consultation. These improvements will help ensure that the federal government respects tribal sovereignty and works in partnership with tribal governments to minimize adverse consequences of infrastructure projects on current and former tribal lands and resources. That tribes no longer maintain sole claim to specific religious or historic sites, or that government infrastructure requires construction at a specific location, does not render these tribal lands, artifacts, and sites any less sacred. This concludes my oral statement. I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Now I welcome Mr. Cameron for his testimony.
Chairman Gallego, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the administration's coordination in construction of barriers to address security and the humanitarian crisis at our nation's southern border. My name is Scott Cameron. I am the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget at the Department of the Interior. The southern border is a major entry point for criminals, gang members, and illicit narcotics. Along this border, cultural resources, wilderness areas, wildlife refuges, plants and animals are adversely impacted by land degradation and destruction from unauthorized vehicles, trash, fires, contaminated water, and other activities related to unlawful border activity. The department manages lands that cover 40% of the southern border. The impacts of illegal activity along the border are evident on all of these lands. At Oregon Pipe National Monument, for example, in the last 3 years alone, National Park Service rangers have arrested 71 people, apprehended more than 1,200 illegal aliens, and intercepted 7,500 pounds of marijuana. People die trying to cross the border illegally here. Since 2010, the remains have been found of almost 200 individuals suspected to have died attempting to cross the border illegally. Unfortunately, as was mentioned earlier, at least one American, a National Park Service ranger, Chris Eggle, has been murdered by criminals crossing the border. Without an effective barrier, there will be more deaths and more movement of drugs that ruin lives at a distance. Through implementation of President Trump's directives, the department has made it a priority to work closely with the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and the Department of Defense, among other agencies, to protect the wildlife, natural, and cultural resources that occur on federal lands along the border. Our work with these agencies enhances the safety of those that live, work, and recreate in the region. At Oregon Pipe, CBP has worked collaboratively with over 100 local stakeholders, including federal, state, and local government agencies, and of course, tribes. The National Park Service worked collaboratively with CBP during pre-construction planning processes to identify known archaeological sites and has worked to protect them. NPS has also recommended, and CBP has agreed, to having an archaeological monitor on site during construction activities, with the authority, incidentally, to stop work as necessary to minimize loss of or damage to archaeological sites. As an example of this collaboration, NPS, in coordination with CBP, identified Quito Baquito Springs as a significant resource area. In order to protect the hydrology, wildlife, and cultural resources of this area, NPS established an agreement with the U.S. Geological Survey to provide real-time monitoring for Quito Baquito, notably taking into consideration the concerns expressed by the tribes, who requested a 5-mile buffer for any wells from Quito Baquito. CBP and the Army Corps of Engineers therefore placed the closest wells for this project 8 miles east and 7 miles west, with the latter being a pre-existing refurbished well, to ensure protection of the water resources at Quito Baquito. In early October, NPS archaeologists discovered several bone fragments during an archaeological survey close to Quito Baquito Springs, near the southwestern corner of the monument, but north of the Roosevelt Reservation area, and so outside of the project area. An osteologist viewed the fragments and determined one was human, but many were not. Discussions with the Tohono O'odham Nation were initiated on October 24, 2019, regarding this discovery. In November, NPS crews identified 3 additional bone fragments during a data recovery project that consisted of the surface collection of artifacts near the same area, this time within the Roosevelt Reservation and within the project area. An osteologist determined that these bone fragments consisted of animal remains and a rock, but during a subsequent site visit to the same area, 2 additional remains were found also within the reservation area. These remains could not be identified by the field archaeologist, but both were later confirmed as human. Along the southern border, the department will continue to support interdepartmental partnerships. We will also continue our engagement with affected tribes. We are trying to work closely with the tribes, and when we find any artifacts or any human remains, we engage in a process to return those to the tribe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me run over, and I apologize for that.
Thank you to our witnesses for our testimony. We'll now moving on to the questions portion of it, and I will recognize myself for the first 5 minutes. Mr. Cameron, the Department of Interior, along with other federal agencies, is charged with upholding our trust responsibility to Native American tribes. Mr. Cameron, what does that responsibility entail?
There are a number of statutes, Mr. Chairman, as I know you're very much aware, that relate to the relationship between the tribes and the federal government. Fundamentally involves, I think, communication, conversation, the federal government trying to understand what the concerns are of the tribes, and the federal government figuring out, in light of that information, what's an appropriate course of action.
Mr. Cameron, to be more specific, is it the position of the Department Interior that protecting tribal sacred sites and cultural and historical artifacts is part of that responsibility, both on tribal and non-tribal land?
Yes, sir. As a general principle, I think that's true. I think it's less clear in terms of off-tribal lands than it may be in terms of on federal lands, or certainly on an Indian reservation. But as a general principle, I think the federal government is responsible for working with the tribes to be concerned about their cultural heritage and helping them conserve that.
Okay. In light of the evidence you have heard today, evidence showing the destruction of multiple sites, including burial sites that are sacred to Native people, how is it possible for you to argue that this activity is not a violation of that trust responsibility then?
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not familiar with all activity going on across the entire border. I am aware of the fact that the Congress provided authority to the federal government.
Just specific to what you heard today and from the testimony of other witnesses is what I'm referring to, not the grander border area.
Yes, sir. So the way I would respond to that is that the National Park Service, and indeed all of our bureaus, when in the conduct of any of our activities we discover cultural resources or human remains, most certainly, we go through a process with the tribes to try to repatriate, if you will, those resources if they're interested in doing that.
Just moving on then, on the first panel, Chairman Norris discussed the fact that CBP expedited its construction on several secret sites, including Monument Hill, after Chairman Grijalva visited and pointed out these places. Given your department's close working relationship with CBP, can you provide a concrete explanation of why the timeline and construction on these sites was moved up? Can you confirm the department intended to preempt any opposition to the destruction of these places?
Mr. Chairman, I'm unaware of what particular stretches of ground DHS was planning on constructing when. What I can tell you is none of these, the human remains that have been found were found from Monument Hill, if that's at all helpful.
When was the last time you had consultation with DHS regarding this construction?
The department has conversations almost on a daily basis with DHS in terms of our activities along the entire southern border.
When was the last time there was coordinated meetings with the Tohono Nation or other tribes regarding the sacred sites?
Let's see, so according to my records, most of the activity, certainly the most recent one that I'm aware of was in December 2019, when CBP, the Park Service, conducted a meeting with the members of Tohono O'odham to discuss construction activities at Monument Hill and Quito Baquito. That's the last one I'm aware of. There may have been one subsequent, Mr. Chairman.
So when Chairman Norris received I think it's email or text that they're about to start blasting, when would that occur?
I don't know, sir.
Were you made aware prior to Chairman Norris getting that notification that they're about to start blasting?
I certainly was not. There's a possibility other folks at the department may have been, but I was not, no.
You could see how that doesn't, according to what I believe the Tohono Nation sees, and I think what many of us see, that does not show a certain level of respect or tribal consultation or coordination when one of our trusted leaders and community leaders and tribal leaders is getting an email about blasting to start. Lastly, I'd like to make sure that we get a record of all the communications and meetings between CBP and the Department of Interior regarding the project. And I yield back my time.
Mr. Cameron, in your testimony, you state, and I quote, "Cultural resources, wilderness areas, wildlife refuges, plant and animals are adversely impacted by land degradation and destruction from trails, trash, fires, and other activities related to the unlawful border crossings," end of quote. Did you make that statement?
Yes, sir, I certainly did.
You add, in quote, "Construction of border barriers will reduce or eliminate impacts from illegal entry and will help maintain the character of these lands and resources." Do you have things that back that up? I mean, do we see where a current fence is? Do we see a better area of vegetation?
Well, sir, I think it's very clear that if you don't have illegal vehicles driving willy-nilly over an area, you're less likely to have destruction of archaeological resources. You're less likely to be running over, endangered desert tortoises. You're less likely to be inflicting all sorts of damage on the land and the resources associated with it. And by creating a wall, if you're limiting the traffic, then those resources are easier to restore and less likely to be damaged. Not to mention the fact that you won't have people trying to cross that area and ended up dying, as has happened.
Now, in implementing this mandate, you outline legal requirements placed on the agencies that, despite the waiver authority being in place, must be carried out. You cover an extensive list of resource protection actions and stakeholder consultations performed by the federal governments. Specific to border infrastructure and Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, you cite consultation with over 100 entities, including federal, state, and local government agencies and tribes, among others. You stated these actions and requirements have resulted in, 1, siting and wall alignments to identify known archaeological sites, ethnographic resources, and areas with a high potential for intact cultural resources, identifying sensitive plant species and avoiding impacts to federally listed species habitat, real-time monitoring and alarm for a Quito Baquito spring hydrology system to ensure the protection of the resource. Mr. Cameron, my question to you, does the government of Mexico offer monitors to ensure the drug cartels or unlawful immigrants avoid these archaeological sites?
Sort of the best of my knowledge, they do not.
As a follow-up, to your knowledge, do the drug cartels or unlawful migrants offer mitigation strategies to reduce their impacts on the cultural sites and environment?
I think it's fair to say, Mr. Gosar, that the drug cartels and other illegal people doing things on the border are oblivious to or don't care about our Endangered Species Act or NEPA for that matter.
Do you know if they consult the tribes or other impacted stakeholders?
I would be really surprised if they did, Mr. Gosar.
Now, is there evidence that the border wall will impact listed species such as the Sonoran pronghorn?
There's the possibility. What I'd also point out is the department for a number of years has undertaken mitigation activities to try to protect fish and wildlife populations in the border area and more generally. And I know there have been some efforts undertaken to help restore populations of Sonoran pronghorn.
But in a wide open aspect, which is frequented by drug smugglers and cartel members, it seems to me like they would be very problematic to those species recoveries.
In fact, Mr. Grosser, I would, if I were a drug smuggler with a gun and I was hungry, I'd be tempted to shoot a desert pronghorn and have it for dinner.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. The border wall that currently exists there, we were just there last week. I mean, there's barriers, the cross brace that's on the ground, like the Normandy cross stuff. Has that really mitigated and helped the area?
I don't have specific information on that. I think it's really clear that a low barrier or a vehicle barrier is not nearly as effective as a sort of barrier that CBP is installing along the border at this point. Clearly, the existing barriers have not stopped illegal movement of people. They've not stopped drug trafficking.
I agree, but they stopped a lot of traffic. Trucks are, we heard that over 1,000 different violations with vehicles were actually stopped by putting the Normandy barrier in place.
Yeah. Yes, sir, I think that's successful. We've also seen, as you've illustrated with some of the photographs you've shown earlier, there are abandoned vehicles perhaps just south of those barriers that are causing issues.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Representative Holland.
Thank you, Chairman. My first question will go to Dr. Ortiz. Those of us in Indian country know that when federal agencies fail or refuse to engage in tribal consultation on a project, mistrust can result. My first question is, how do you see the relationship with the interior and tribal nations developing under the current administration after everything that's happened? And is the current situation at the border reversible?
GAO has not done work specifically looking at that relationship. We do know that on occasions, like we've seen over the past couple of months, when consultations or other requirements are waived, it further exacerbates mistrust that may have already existed, and it really risks irreparable harm to sites. Sometimes these sacred sites and cultural resources could have been preserved with very modest adjustments. And GAO's research suggests that even outside the realm of formal consultation, developing a good ongoing relationship with tribal and local stakeholders will help you figure out ways to conduct or to construct infrastructure with the minimal harm potential, potentially minimalizing harm.
I understand. And when all this occurs, what does the GAO recommend the federal government do to regain tribal trust?
GAO recommends improvements to tribal consultation practices specifically, such as we've recommended to 15 agencies that they should tell tribes how their input was weighed. We are also recommending improvements to the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council in terms of centralizing information so that tribes can be consulted in a more timely fashion, and that there's better coverage to recognize which tribes are concerned with the geographic area, even if they don't live there.
That's better than a text a few hours before the incident happens, I guess. Thank you, Dr. Ortiz. Mr. Cameron, with respect to your testimony regarding, and my colleague, Mr. Gosar, brought this up, regarding the cultural resources, plants, animals being adversely impacted from the various negative impacts, including trash and, people driving through there. Can trash be cleaned up?
Sorry.
I mean, it's a yes or no. Can trash be cleaned up?
Yes.
Okay, good. But a sacred site that's been blasted, it can never be made whole again. I want you to understand that. And you know why? Because ancestors put those things in the ground with care and love and tradition and prayers. Those can never be regained again. And I want you to understand that. You can't equate sacred sites and burial grounds with trash. You can't equate that with people walking through the desert or leaving their abandoned trucks there. That pales in comparison to what these ancestors of these people have done. They put those things there for a purpose because they knew that in the future we would rely on that knowledge and knowing that those ancestors are there. I don't expect you to understand that, but I'm trying to impart a little information on you so that you understand how they feel about this and why they cry when they see that place being blasted apart. You can't equate that with trash and with, somebody, they burned up this tree or the damage that this administration is doing to this area is irreparable. It's irreparable. And you didn't even ask. Nobody asked permission of these people to do any of that. And it's shameful. It's immoral, like I said during the last panel. We're having this hearing because we care deeply about what's happening with this land. But it's all over. It's happening all over the country with this administration. And that's why I will say again, I don't know how any of you sleep at night. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, Representative Holland. Now I recognize Representative Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the two members of the panel. Before I make my remarks, I just have to preface this by saying that for all of the talk of protecting religious freedom, I can't believe what the administration and its representatives here are telling us in the exchange that is taking place and how sacrilegious it really is. Since taking office, Donald Trump has relentlessly tried to fund construction of an ineffective wall at the cost of taxpayers, the environment, and indigenous peoples, as we see today, all while helping his friends make profits at the expense of our communities, such as in waiving the procurement process. It's beyond egregious and repugnant to think that this administration, one that pushes for religious freedoms, is also violating the sanctity of the ancestral lands of indigenous people in our country. The administration continues to bypass environmental regulations and other laws in its efforts to construct the border wall. But it will not go unchecked, not while Democrats control the House. Dr. Ortiz, in what ways is it within the purview of the federal government to actively engage in tribal consultation, and why is that consultation important?
Tribal consultation is a critical way in which we demonstrate the federal respect for tribal sovereignty and the government-to-government relationship we have with tribes. When we act to protect archaeological, historical, cultural, natural resources that are of importance to Native Americans, we are acting consistent with the federal trust responsibility.
Can you elaborate on the current barriers that hinder effective consultation with the tribes?
There are several current barriers, and among those that came out most frequently in GAO's review were those dealing with the timeliness of notification and the adequacy of notification, whether or not a tribe that had ancestral or treaty rights in an area was actually notified. We've also noticed there have been problems with whether or not agencies genuinely weigh tribal input. I think as one representative said earlier today, the going through the motion of compliance rather than actually weighing input and acting with the respect that a government-to-government relationship merits.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron, do you feel that your agency has done an adequate job in consulting with the tribes?
Yeah. Congressman, as a general principle, I know Assistant Secretary Sweeney has been involved in numerous tribal consultations around the country. In the particular instance we're talking about today, the Congress passed a statute that provides for an expedited process for construction of a border wall, and the administration has chosen to exercise the authority that the Congress gave it.
Is the consultation adequate?
Adequacy.
Your opinion.
Adequacy, I think, is probably in the eye of the beholder, Congressman. What I can tell you
Okay,
is
thank you. In your testimony, you note that the agency has conducted 90 formal consultation sessions on 17 topics and 30 informal listening sessions with tribes. What's the difference between a formal consultation and an informal listening session?
I'm afraid I'm out of my legal depth to give you a precise answer.
Okay,
I'd happy to do that.
do you
for the
consider
record.
emails a form of consultation?
I consider emails a form of communication.
Are they consultation?
All I can tell you is that the department and CBP have taken steps to communicate regularly with the tribe, with the affected tribes, in terms of activity on the border. And we made a good faith effort to understand the tribe's concerns and to try to address them.
Regardless of what you say, this administration is bulldozing through and desecrating sacred sites with little to no consultation with the tribes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize Chairman Grijalva.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cameron, when Interior effectively lost control of the public lands back in 2005 with the Real ID Act, and we ceded that responsibility to Homeland Security, much of the decision-making that occurs around issues such as sacred sites, consultation, has been ceded to another agency. And you mentioned in your testimony how strong interagency cooperation and meetings occur. Let me ask you about one topic, if there was any discussion. The decision and the change, the administrative change to expedite and waive and expedite the procurement process, and so that the wall could be built more rapidly. And the firms that came on, did Interior have any role in assessing whether they understood what a relationship with a tribal nation might be? That they understood what a sacred site might be, a burial site, a ceremonial site? Did you have any input into assessing that construction company's ability to work in the Southwest, to work adjacent to Indian land, and to be able to do that and still be respectful of the historic, cultural, and human issues that are involved with that? Did you have any input in that?
Mr. Chairman, what I can tell you is that Interior and CBP talked on a regular basis. There were archaeological surveys that the Park Service did.
I'm talking about the firms that got hired.
I'm not aware of specific details in terms of briefings with the individual contractors, but I'd be happy to try to find that information for the record, Mr. Chairman, if you'd like.
Yeah, I think that would be important, or we can request it ourselves. But the other issue is that, Mr. Cameron, that I think is important, and it goes to to the issue of consultation, which separates what we're talking about here from the other issues that are going on relative to the wall. That trust responsibility is embedded in the work of Congress and in the Constitution. And as such, I think it has preeminence in many of the discussions that we're having. And something as important, as enshrined as trust responsibility and nation-to-nation consultation gets routinely waived, ignored. Don't you think that is going to create a fundamental problem? You keep saying we have the right, based on 2005, that we can waive whatever we want. Fine. But in terms of Interior and its role and its jurisdiction and its relationship with Indian country, don't you think you can't be that cavalier about that situation?
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that Interior is not being cavalier at all. Interior is having conversations all the time with the Tohono O'odham tribe, and not to mention other tribes in the Southwest. We take our trust responsibility very seriously, which at its core is open communication between the federal government and the tribes and trying to understand each other's mutual concerns and interests. I think, as you've observed, Mr. Chairman, is rather an unusual statutory situation along the border with the Roosevelt Reservation, and the Congress has given the executive branch unusual authorities. And the administration has determined that it's in the best interest of the national security of the
The
United
last
States.
Congress gave them unusual authority. This Congress has given them unusual authority. That's why you had to go to the Defense Department to get money to build a wall, because this Congress didn't do it. But anyway, my other point is, Dr. Ortiz, different agencies, and when you talk to tribal leaders, different agencies, some agencies find the requirement of consultation burdensome. Tribes respond that it is subjective, that some do it well, like you gave examples. Is there a place for some level of uniformity and a legal mandate on how consultation should be done across the federal government, agency to agency, so that we don't have different boxes that are being checked off, that there is a criteria of how you interact and how you deal with tribes? Do you think there's a need for that Congress should explore?
GAO hasn't directly evaluated the need for that. We've looked specifically at different policies. Where we do see some policies really shine in terms, or some agency policies really shine in terms of what they demand for those consultations, in terms of what they expect agencies to do, and in terms of the manner in which they treat the input and expertise of tribes.
Thank you. Yield back. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their insightful testimony and the members for their questions. As I stated before, the members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.